Okay. I'm happy to see all corporate community in our corporate governance professional association. My name is Vladimir Gonin. I'm a board member of CGPA, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Tom O'Connor, who will speak today about the board. I reviewed, and we have a small talk with Tom, and I'm absolutely sure that it will be a great input and insight for you. And let's cherish the moment when we can meet offline, because nobody knows how long it will be going on. So enjoy our evening, and Tom, take your floor.
Thank you very much. I'm going to switch to the mask again, but if you can hear me through this mask, I'll stick with this. It's more comfortable. So let me get straight into it here. What I'd like to cover is just give a brief overview of some of my experience. My background is I'm currently living here in Ukraine, but I've worked in many different industries over the last 20 years. And I'm the former chief executive of the Irish Cooperative Association, in which we represented about 150 cooperatives, slightly different governance structure. But based on my experience there, I want to give an example of two cooperatives. One that really focused in on good corporate governance, one did not. And you'll see a very dramatic difference between the one that did and the one that didn't. So I want to touch on just board structure and executive management, and also the need to have a strong sense of vision and purpose within your organization. Then I'll introduce, if you're not familiar with it already, something called the business life cycle, and the importance of that in maintaining relevance within the board. And I'll finish in with corporate culture. But as I do this, I will keep coming back to this one company, this Kerry Group. Let me introduce this co-op and the neighboring co-op. So this story is actually quite personal for me. That's my home there. And this is my local co-op, 150 meters away. It's in the southwest of Ireland, very poor part of Ireland. The land is bad, the climate is bad, very beautiful, but that's what we have. We have good nature and tourism, but the land is bad and the climate is bad. But the oldest cooperative in Ireland exists 200 meters up the street from it. And when I say the oldest cooperative, formed in 1894, it ceased to be last year. It's now part of another co-op. But it survived for 126 years. And the last year of operation, it had sales of $14 million, 40 million euros, sorry, and a share capital of 7 million. About 40 years ago, in 1970, this co-op would have been double the size of what it is now. It would have employed about maybe 30 people. It would have been making butter, it would have been making animal feed, and it would have been making cheese. But in the early 1970s, 12 kilometers away, you had another cooperative start, a cooperative called Kerry Cooperative. And it was formed by farmers, what you call in Ukraine, peasant farmers. So the chairman of the board, he was 63 years of age. Very little education, but he was one of the strongest chairmen that the industry has ever seen in Ireland. So cooperative, again, formed by small farmers. The whole region, you've got same culture, same size of farmers, everything's pretty much the same. But this was Kerry Group last year. Formed in 1972, $7.2 billion in sales last year. The company is worth close to 20 billion. It's one of the wealthiest food companies in the world today, producing 18,000 products, got 26,000 employees, 1,000 research and development scientists, 150 factories all across the world, sales in 150 countries, and its global headquarters is still in a small town in Ireland. So what I'm trying to go through as I go through this presentation is how do you have 1970, two similar sized co-ops with the same demographics, same culture, everything's the same. One no longer exists. As I say, when it finished, it had 9 employees carrying out, 26,000 employees. The other company, when it finished with one product, it just produced milk, nothing else. Carried about 18,000 different products. And this is something we're quite proud of in Ireland. It's still, you might even call this a village in Ireland, in Ukraine, we call this a small city or a large town even. But the company has got operations in 40 different countries all around across the world, and it's still managed and run from the same city in which it started. And it's had 4 CEOs in its history, and they've never hired an outside CEO. So they've put so much focus on management and governance that anytime there's a change of CEO, the succession comes from within the company. And I suppose what made Kerry different when it started, because it did start quite small, was the board of directors. You know, in terms of attitude, you know, they were very clear on what they wanted, very clear on compliance. One thing about Irish cooperative law, if you sit on the board of directors in an Irish cooperative and the board sanctions a loan, if the loan is bad, the board of directors are financially responsible. So there's an added incentive in Ireland around compliance. It goes back, the law is about 130 years old, but a board member in Ireland is one of the few instances in Ireland where a board member can go to jail. So they can actually take your farm. If you're a farmer director of a board of a cooperative in Ireland, they can actually take your farm to pay off a bad loan. This is where Kerry were really different. At the time, you've got hundreds of cooperatives in Ireland. Let's call them small businesses. You had hundreds of these small businesses that just happened to be farmer-owned. But they had greater vision, planning, and strategy incorporated into their DNA on that board better than any other similar-sized food company in Ireland. And really, this is what defines that board of directors, and I think this is what should define any sort of board. You know, what is the board there for? I would argue the board is there for 2 key strategic reasons. One, it's to make sure that the company maintains its relevance. In other words, you know, even if you're running your own, you know, even managing your own business, you still need the confidence and trust of bankers, of finance companies. You still have to attract investment, and you have to be adding value for shareholders. So you have to maintain the responsibilities of the board is to maintain, number 1, the relevance of the company, and number 2, the sustainability. So you have to stay going as a going concern. You also have to be looking into the future. Are you serving the interests of shareholders is a primary responsibility, meeting performance objectives, and reducing risks, costs, investing in the future, etc. So again, how did Kerry do this initially? Their initial thing they did, again, quite unique at the time. So first thing they want to do, of course, is adding shareholder value. They're all milk farmers. So how do you add value to milk? You process it into a product. So they built their first factory 2 years after forming in 1974. One thing they understood as I say, they were small farmers with a very strong chairman. They didn't know anything about operating a factory, owning a factory. So the other thing they did strategically as a board was they said, we don't have the competence to produce these value-added products. So what they did was they built the first factory as a joint venture. So they brought in an American partner who, one, had the technology and two, had the market. So, you know, they understood themselves, we can't do it all ourselves. Let's find the right partner who brought finance, who brought technical expertise, and who also bought the product. The other thing they did, which again, Ireland's quite a conservative country, and for this to happen in the 1970s, I don't think it would even happen today. The other thing they did was they hired their CEO was 27 years of age. So you had all these guys who were, most of the board members were 60 plus years of age, and they hired a 27-year-old to start this company. And the first thing that 27-year-old did was he hired 12 employees. The youngest was 22, and the oldest was 32. So, very unusual setup in terms of in a very conservative, farming is a conservative, by its nature is a conservative business. But everything they did at the time was very bold and very brave. And that's because initially, that board, it had a very strong board of directors and a very focused board of directors. They had a plan, they believed in the plan, and, picked what turned out to be one of the most inspired hires ever in the Irish food industry, picked a 27-year-old to build this business. So I just want to touch on that a small bit. So what that board did at the time was, they stuck with what their responsibilities were, which is, choosing CEO, approving major policies or formulating that strategy, making major decisions, oversee performance but not management, and serve as external advocates for the company. So when I say serve as external advocates, they also helped bring other farmer members into that because they grew very, very quickly. But this is important, and this is often quite difficult. They oversee performance, but they do not manage it. You hire a CEO to run your business, you don't run the business. The best it has ever been put to me, the chairman of the largest company in New Zealand once said to me, he says, the role of the board is to hire what is called the chief executive. The chief executive executes, that's what the word executive is in there, executes the orders of the board. If the chief executive cannot execute the orders of the board, it is up to the board to execute the chief executive. So, the CEO, obviously you want someone there who he or she has to be bright, ambitious, has vision, but these guys understood, which is very difficult, as I say, when this is a farmer-owned business. They own the business, but they stayed out of the day-to-day operation of the business. So, they hired this young CEO to operate in line with the board's direction, keep the board educated and informed, and bring to the board well-documented recommendations and information to help them support their decision-making and their oversight responsibilities as a board. I suppose one other unique thing about Kerry, and I've worked with many cooperatives in Ireland to help formulate strategy. And in doing so, they kind of, I've been invited by many companies to come in and develop strategy. And really, it's always about, we need our strategy document. We need this big strategy document. And then you kind of say, okay, guys, what's your values and beliefs? What's your mission? What are your objectives as a company? And if they're like, yeah, we'll get to that, we'll write the strategy first, and we'll get to these things at the end. But what I've often found is this from the DNA of an organization. It's up to the board, I think, to define and decide these three things. As simple as they sound, these are probably the three most important things. And it has been my experience, and I've taken some work on this in the past, and I've always said to them, we're going to focus on this first. And I just refuse to work with them unless we do these things. I'm a bit headstrong sometimes, so they let me do it. But in letting me doing it, they'll say, okay, let's entertain them for the next hour or two, and we'll finish this. Every time I've done it, we spend 4 or 5 days with the board getting this right. Because what you'll find around the board, as in life, when you put 9 or 10 people around the table, you assume that everybody's thinking the same way as you are. And then all of a sudden you find out that people have different ideas, different concepts of what the company is about. And I've done this now 3 or 4 times, and in doing it, it's always the same. We spend a huge amount of time on these 3 things, and we write this in about a day or 2. This becomes very easy. Developing a strategy for a company is very easy once you define what that company is. And I think sometimes that's overlooked on boards of directors, that there's not enough discussion sometimes where the board kind of, do they all understand what the company is about, what direction the company is taking, etc. So I use 2 words here, clarity and strategy. I think if you have defined what your organization is about and what you want to achieve, you have the clarity. And I think if you've got clarity, it's very easy to develop strategy. But I don't think enough work has been done on this, but I think if you start to survey boards, I think you'll often find, not all of them, some are very good, but you'll often find that the clarity is sometimes missing. You could have people on the board for 10 or 15 years, and they have different ideas, which is fine, of which way the company should be going. But if they come to a board meeting once every month, and they're all pulling in different directions, you never really have a clear, defined, and thought out strategy. So again, let me continue to bring it back to Kerry. Kerry's initial formula, as they put it, they didn't invent this. I don't know who did, but this has been around for many years. But they had this belief of capability, strategy, and capital equals sustainable, profitable growth. And capability here, for the most part, in Kerry, is people. Better than any other company that ever came out of Ireland, they invested heavily on the capability of the people within the company. If you have the right people, and if you have the right strategy, very easy to find money. Now, you might say, take it easy, it's not easy to find money. But Kerry's belief was, if you're always able to show very strong capability and strategy, very easy to find capital. Their first huge acquisition, and this is well documented, they bought a European American company for $400 million, and they didn't have the money. So they agreed, they didn't sign, but they'd agreed to buy the company for $400 million. And the owner of the company, the chairman of the company that was selling, said, I hope you have the money. And they just sat across the table and said yes. They got the money, they came up with $250 million within 48 hours, and they did. Because their reputation on this, and this was so strong, they found the financing. But again, talk about strategy and clarity, this was their initial strategy. Kerry Co-op will double in size every 5 years. And that's what they did. That's how they grew. They just had simple, and I come to it at the end, their kind of simple management philosophy. But everybody on the board and everybody in executive management, everybody in that company understood what the strategy was, understood the direction of the company, and understood what the shareholders expected. So this is kind of the first 10 years of their life. At the end of the 1970s, they were still a milk company, 100% in milk. I want to touch on something called the business life cycle. And again, I'll relate it back to this organization. You know, you can have strategies and plans, but life doesn't always go according to plan. And that's because there's something which I'll touch on called the business life cycle. Just to give an example of the life cycle of two products. One a very typical example, one not so typical. These are two cars, which you may be familiar with. This is the Fiat 124, first produced in 1966 in Italy. And this is the Toyota Corolla, first produced in 1966. Fiat stopped producing the Fiat 124 in 1970, and it became to be known as the Lada. So Fiat sold this to Vaz, and this is the difference. This is the product life cycle of this product over 50 years. The reality is that's not your typical product life cycle. This is the Toyota Corolla today. So, you know, this hasn't changed much over 50 years, but the reality is this, what would have happened if the same development and life cycle went in? But there's studies out there today that the typical life cycle of anything today is about 7 years. So things are constantly evolving once every 7 years or so. It depends on the industry, it depends on the business. Some are faster, some are slower. But if the attitude is, how can I stay as I am and do nothing for the next 20 years, it probably means you won't exist in 20 years. Which brings me to this. What's typically the business life cycle, and it goes in 5 different phases. You have justification for your business. The concept are starting out. There's a lot of energy at the start. Everybody's all excited about doing something new, doing something different. You know, as you get it off the ground, the enthusiasm and the energy is there, and then there's a strong spurt of growth. And then over time, the company starts to mature. Everybody, it's natural, it's human nature. You start getting comfortable, you start taking things easy, start taking your foot off the accelerator a small bit. And then there's a plateau. And you start to decline. And 2 things will happen. You'll either close your eyes, put your head in the sand, and continue to decline, or you'll reinvent yourself again. But that, in many ways, is a constant evolution, and that's what I mean by these 7-year blocks. You know, the world is moving, the world is changing, your competitors are changing. Like I was talking to someone during the week about a friend of mine who's gone on about the kiosks in Kiev in the streets. So a lot of the kiosks have been removed from the streets, but you'll even notice that the kiosks that are remaining are now different. You know, if you look 2 or 3 years ago, the kiosks, you had your little window, you didn't know who was inside there, you didn't see what was in there. But now if you notice, most of the kiosks in Kiev, they're open, they're glass, you can see what's inside there. So you have, and I don't know what's driving it or causing it, but I think you have today, your consumer wants to know what they're buying. They want to see what's inside. So if you just look all across Kiev, within the next 2 or 3 years, you won't see any of these windowless kiosks. They're all fully open, and you can see inside, you can see the product inside there, etc. So that's what we mean by business life cycle. So this is important from a board perspective, that you're always kind of looking, what's the next thing? What do we change today? You know, when we're here in this part of the process, what should we be changing here so that we can continue this growth? And that's, again, with Kerry, that's one thing they always did, was they always had a sense of purpose and relevance. And they were always just one step ahead of the competition. And this is a great quote, I don't know where I found it, but business may know what to do and how to do it, but they may have forgot why they're doing it, which goes back to the point I made earlier on, particularly around the, sitting around the boardroom table. Does everybody know why they're there? Does everybody know why the company exists? Or is it like very prescriptive? Oh, next year we need to make, 1,000 units of this. And, we're going to make it in 3 factories. But, the why is what's important. Not so much the what and the how. You need to understand the why first. So as I say, the company in the 1970s was a dairy company. And they started as a dairy company. Their shareholders were milk farmers. But then in 1984, in Ireland, all across Europe, Ireland was part of the European Union at that stage, there was restrictions put on milk production. So there was milk quotas introduced in Ireland in 1984. So that meant that farmers couldn't grow the size of their farms. They were only given a certain allocation of milk. They couldn't produce more than that or they'd be fined. And that stayed in place from 1984 until 2015. So Kerry understood that there was limitations how much they could grow their milk business. So then they started again. The purpose was we have to double in size every 5 years. They knew they couldn't with these quotas. They were razor-like focused on adding as much value as possible for their shareholders. So what they decided to do was start getting into other products. So they got into the meat business in 1983. They grew so fast in the 80s, when other milk companies were actually getting smaller, they went public. So the initial history of the company, the farmers were funding the growth, but they grew so fast they went public. They became a public traded company. They made their first major international acquisition about a year later, 18 months later. But then, in the 1990s, they changed again. They established themselves as a leader in flavors and ingredients, all different types of ingredients. In the 2000s, they pretty much become a global company at this stage, and then seeing the emerging trend for health. That's what I mean by functional ingredients here. So they started getting into making products and ingredients that had a health benefit. In 2010, the 2010s, they kind of changed again. They became more of the nutrition. Became all about taste and nutrition. This year, less than 10% of their business is in milk. So even though they started out as a milk company owned by milk farmers, it's less than 10% of their business today. And just last week, actually, and again, this is what we talk about, this life cycle, they announced their strategy last week for 2030, or 2 weeks ago, I think. They've got a new sustainability strategy. Everybody is now becoming more and more worried about climate change. So their new strategy is called Beyond the Horizon, and they're focused on providing sustainable nutrition, so sustainably sourced ingredients, and they aim to feed 2 billion. They aim for their products to be in other food products that will feed 2 billion people per day, every day by 2030. So as I say, even though that's 10 years away, 2030 is here, they have to start doing it here. So what was built into their original DNA from a corporate governance and an attitude perspective still carries through today, almost 50 years later. On that corporate culture, I just want to touch on it briefly. I might say some things that might please some people here, I might say other things that might upset some people here, but I'll just give some of my own opinions on some things around board. Board size. I suppose one area where Kerry were weak was they probably had a board that was too big. But it was politically correct to do at the time because they were representing farmers from all these different regions. So they probably had a board that was bigger than what it should be. But I would say, you know, 9 to 11 people on a board is probably, that's more than enough. You know, probably should be less. But you know, a board is too big. You all know yourself. You get 30 people in the room and you try and get everybody to agree on something. It's impossible. But if you get 5 people, you know, it's. One thing I did when I was chief executive of the Cooperative Association in Ireland, because farming is male dominated, I tried to get more women on boards. The problem we had in Ireland is on our boards, it's mainly male dominated. We're doing that for a very simple reason. Women listen, men don't listen. So, you know, the dynamics of a board where there is a gender mix is actually, it's quite intriguing to watch it sometimes. Because men do have a nature to show, here's what I know, whereas men will use information, if we use the word information, to convey what they know, whereas women will often, particularly in a decision-making process, will use information to absorb the information and then make a more nuanced decision on that. One thing that's often overlooked, and it's one thing we focused on too in Ireland with our boards, was around just the settings of a board meeting. That might sound as though it's not important, but in some ways it is. We have a tendency in Ireland, for example, within some of these cooperatives, they used to organise the board meetings in the evening. So they give the farmer the opportunity, because if the farmer was a board member, he'd do his work and then he'd come in the evening to these board meetings. But like in general, if you're holding a board meeting, you know, it should be held at a part of the day where everybody's alert, but everybody's got energy, things like that. So sometimes you will see board meetings scheduled probably too late in the day or after lunch or after dinner, and everybody's just kind of falling asleep. The setting is also important. You know, sometimes you have, we used to encourage that board meetings would not take place within company offices. We'd say, you know, hire a room in a hotel or something like that, because, you know, there's someone coming in, they want documents signed, so there's too many distractions sometimes. And the other thing then is scheduling board meetings. We used to schedule board meetings a year in advance. So the first board meeting of the year, we would actually organize with the board the schedule of the regular board meetings for the year ahead. The reason being is people could plan for it. So there'd be no, you know, short notice. There'd be no, oh, I'm on holidays, or you know, half the board would not show up, etc. And the other big thing was board packs. Again, it depends on the chairman, but a strong chairman will always insist on a board pack. So a week before the board meeting, every board member is sent a packet of information. They have the agenda. They know what's going to be discussed. They have the supporting information about the supporting information for all the items that are on the agenda. It sounds simple, but it's not always done. And then in corporate governance training within the industry in Ireland, there would often be, we were often electing the wrong people to the board sometimes. We were electing people who would I describe as good managers, but not necessarily good leaders. Now, you don't want, 15 fantastic leaders on the board. You need a mix of things, but there's a difference between a manager and a leader. And sometimes the biggest problem I would have seen is where they were electing a chairperson who'd been sitting on the board for 10 years, and they're like, well, he knows what's going on and he's been here for 10 years, so it's now his turn to become the chairman. But you need, particularly in a chairman, if you don't have a chairperson who's a strong character and who has that vision and who can convince others. Like, what is leadership? Leadership occurs when one member modifies the modification or competencies of others in the group. So it's up to the chairman really to kind of lead that board. And then another thing we worked on, particularly with companies where you have multiple shareholders, 90% of the problems I've seen with corporate governance, it's the lack of trust, which typically starts with poor communication. So it's kind of keeping everybody informed and involved, not only around the board table, because that's where the fighting can often actually start first. It's board members who feel they're getting information, others feel they're not getting the information. The lack of trust, I think 9 times out of 10, originates because of poor communication. So what I want to finish with, again, we'll keep with this Kerry theme, and then I'm very happy to take any questions you may have. One thing where Kerry were always particularly strong, from the board down, was in keeping everybody informed. Not only with when I say stakeholder engagement, as I say, it was a shareholder-owned business. So for the first 15 years of his life, all the shareholders were farmers. They were always, both the chairman, whoever the chairman was at the time, and the CEO, they always, at least 2 to 3 times a year, went out and met with in every rayon and every district, and met with the farmers and kept the farmers involved. And they always had a lot less trouble because of that. It's keeping the shareholders, if the shareholder feels he's been kept informed and in the loop, that's very important. The other thing around stakeholder engagement, and I think there's work to be done here in Ukraine on this. I spent 2 summers working for Kerry. I've worked for Kerry myself in the past. One thing where even as a student walking in there the first day, you knew exactly what was expected of you. You knew exactly what the company was about. And the longest serving CEO, Dennis Crossan, often said, he says, when it came to corporate governance at Kerry, he says, if you ask me, if you ask the board of directors, or if you ask a janitor in one of our factories in Asia, what the company is about, he says, you'll probably get the same answer from everybody. And I think sometimes that's, particularly here in Ukraine, I think that's a challenge. Like, you have people at factory level in factories here who don't understand what the company is, it's never been communicated what the objectives of the company is, etc. But one thing Kerry were always good at is every single person in the organization, no matter how senior or how junior, they always knew what the company was about, and they always knew what direction the company was taking. Part of the reason they're so successful at this, there's 2 reasons for it. The first is, no matter where they acquire, so Kerry are now a company that just acquires other businesses all over the world. They have a 100-day strategy that no matter where the company is, no matter what country, no matter what the philosophy of the people are, the culture, the entire company will be absorbed into their corporate culture within 100 days. They have a 100-day plan, what they call the Kerry way, where they absorb and then transform any new acquisition into their own corporate culture and philosophy within 100 days. The other unique thing they have is they would have, I would say, the best graduate management training program in the industry. As I say, Kerry've had 4 CEOs in the last 45 years. The last 2 CEOs started out as students. So what they do is they train within. They're so focused on their management philosophy and how they do things that it's literally applied in every corner of the world, and it's consistent in every corner of the world. But it stems from the top down. And I'm just going to read out 10 quotations. So there was a book written about Kerry 20 years ago. Probably should be another book written about it, but a guy wrote about the first 20 years of our history. And he summarized their management philosophy, their corporate governance philosophy in 10 simple steps. So what are the 10 things that Kerry do that are anyone else? One is they're very clear on writing down short and long-term goals. So, you know, every strategic meeting by the board, it's not a 2-hour conversation of what should be done. It's everything is written down. The belief in Kerry is you're 50% of the way there once it's written down on black and white. When they have issues, they focus on a maximum of 10 issues at any given time. They don't focus on 100 different things. They just take a block of issues and process of elimination. Focus on 10 items to fix on a quarterly basis, monthly basis, whatever the case may be. They know their core competencies, they focus, they continue to build on what they do well, and they work to eliminate weaknesses. So as I say, today they're the largest food ingredient company in the world. When they get into new types of products or new ingredients, they don't try and invent it themselves. They know what they do well, and if they want to get into a new product, they're now in a position where they just acquire someone who's an expert, and they acquire the expertise. They bring in that expertise. Like us to say with the planning, continually monitoring progress. So as they go through these goals, they're not forgotten about a month later. They're like, what do we want to fix? Where is it at? Is it getting better? Good. Is it getting worse? Okay, what needs to be fixed? Keep things very simple. As I say, they have probably one of the simplest communication structures I've ever seen in any organization, even though they have 26,000 employees worldwide. It goes back to doing your problems in pieces. You know, they learn how to, what they call, eat the elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So if they've got big strategic issues, they delegate. They break, you know, either at board level or at executive level, they break the problem down into smaller pieces and then have different management teams fix the smaller issues. And then the last, they use what they call the loose brick theory. As I say, they're the world's largest food ingredient company in the world today. But when they wanted to get into new product areas, they never challenged their biggest competitor first. They look for a small niche in the market that's undefended, build up the expertise, and then start growing. And then, again, it goes back into the culture that was developed there the first day. They always ask themselves, will the organization be more or less profitable without you? And that's really the key to their success, the role of personal responsibility within the organization. That's why their board has always been successful. That's why their management have always been successful. That's why the company has always been successful. It's just now part of their DNA you know, okay, you're sitting on the board of Kerry, you're just not here because you can, you know, you're going to get so many €1,000 per year, or you're not here because it's a nice title. People who within Kerry, they live and breathe Kerry as an organisation. As I say, the other thing they're very good at is this. They're always looking, what's the next thing? They don't wait for the next thing to happen. And this is where I think you can't do this without good corporate governance. You know, when the next thing happens, you have to be planning for ahead of time. Otherwise, you're always behind the curve. So they're always sensing the future. What's next, and how do we change before it happens? They want to be ahead of it when it does happen. And then, again, a lot of this is not rocket science, really. It's fairly straightforward stuff, but it's actually living it. Remember, change is continuous. So you have to be responsive and flexible in the management of change. And I think that's, for me personally, I think from all the boards I've ever worked with, that's mainly when you're into challenges. You're into challenges in two things. One, poor communication, and two, you know, you have people on the board who don't want to change. They're comfortable. It's getting in, as I say, you have companies and organizations that may have been around for a long time, but they get too comfortable. And when people get too comfortable, they don't want to change. But you have to be continuously going through, cycling through that all the time. And for me, that's where, again, communication and strong corporate governance, to be ahead of the competition, to be ahead of the game, for want of a better word. You know, if you don't have strong corporate governance, this may happen. You can still grow, but, you know, it may be that kind of a curve. But the problem is, particularly on boards that I've seen, is people are there for too long, or they get too comfortable, or they don't want to make decisions, and that's when the decline happens. Like when you stop thinking, and when you stop reacting, and when you stop saying, okay, where do we want to be in a year? What do we need to change? That's when that happens. So I hope that was informative. I'm happy to take any questions, if anyone has any questions. As I say, I was chief executive of an organization that was responsible for governance of an entire industry in Ireland. I've also worked with, I've seen some crazy boards of directors. I can tell you some stories. That'll be another next story, but we were talking about Irish coffee before. I need a few Irish coffees to just, what you see on some of these boards of directors. But normally it's when I see the problems are normally down to communication and a lack of poor communication, a lack of personal responsibility, and having too many people around the board who are afraid of change. Everybody's afraid of change, but it's how you react to it, or how you balance that board. And what's most important than that then is I fully believe that the chairperson is quite often the key. If you have a weak chairperson, from my experience, you've got a weak board. But I'm happy to take any questions. Thick skin too, so you can throw any question you want.
Nobody here, I have one.
Okay.
On the one of the very first slides, you had information about objectives of the board, and my question is about fiduciary duty of the board. And you mentioned that the board serves to the shareholders' interests. And this is a quite tricky thing, and we will know that there is a discussion about who actually, which interests, whose interests are the main goal for the board. Either shareholders or the company itself. because sometimes interest of shareholders may contradict the interest of the company itself. I assume that in this case, in Kerry case, there were many shareholders, some thousands, even tens of 16,000 of shareholders, and I assume that you can treat this board as independent members because they didn't represent some particular major shareholders, as it sometimes can be.
So they really didn't. They didn't represent a major shareholder.
Well, it would have. It would have started out. The way a cooperative works now, the shareholder, it's one shareholder, one vote. So it doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how many shares you are. Everybody has the same vote. Now, what I didn't really get into today is the corporate governance structure of the cooperative changed as the company changed. So when they started as a cooperative, all the board members were farmers. But then, of course, when they went public, they had institutional shareholders, and they had financing as well. So you know they were always responsive to maybe shareholders are on board, stakeholders. You know as an organization today, I don't have the exact figures, but the co-op now only owns 13%. So the co-op farmer shareholder has been diluted down. The public is probably 55, 60, and then the rest are institutional shareholders. But their governance structure in terms of bringing in independent shareholders and bringing in specific expertise would have changed over the course of its history, as the company would have changed also in structure. But even though it's still an integral part of the small community in which it started, it's not, you know, it doesn't make its decisions based on what to keep the farmers happy. In fact, if you talk to many Kerry suppliers that they still have their factories, the farmers are not happy because they think the price of milk should be higher. But Kerry's attitude is we can't give you a higher price for milk because you know that's not in the interest of us as a business. We're not here to serve the dairy farmers. We're here to serve the needs of the business.
Really drive a new stage of development, new vision, new project, each stage. Owners,
there was two integral people here at the concept. One was a guy called Eddie Hayes. He was the first chairman. He was, I think he was 64 or 5 years old at the time. Small farmer. He left school when he was about 15 or 16. He'd never finished high school. It hasn't been well covered in Ireland, but there's a book to be written in Ireland about farmer chairman in Ireland. Some of the best chairs of boards I've ever met anywhere, and some of the best leaders I've ever met, they have no formal education. Two of the best chairmen I ever worked with in Ireland they both left school before they were 16 to work on the family farm. But I suppose what in this organization, it's not every organization, but in this organization, because it was a cooperative, the farmers own the organization. So there's a direct connection to the business. And the other thing then was they hired a guy called Dennis Brosnan, you know, 27 years of age. He was only 3 years out of college, but they saw something in him, and he helped build that global organization with the board. Like they were hand in glove, really. they both work together, but they're complete polar opposites. You just old, small farmers, like guys with 10, 20, 30 cows, and a young guy 3 years out of college. But there's some fascinating stories about even how they developed. Like when they realized that there was an opportunity around building food ingredients, that they realized early enough that that's what their business should have been. And one of the first things they did was they went to one of the largest trade shows in the world. They knew who their competition was. So, you know, the management had done their competitive research. And what they did was, and they were a very small company and they didn't have a whole lot of money, but they went to one of these major international food fairs. They knew who the number one competition were. And they bought the cheapest, smallest stand they could get at the trade show, close to this big company. And they sent 5 executives over just to watch the behavior about, you know, how the executives and how the managers from that large company did. Like, they were always out there. Nobody believed they could exceed, and I think that was part of it. Part of their success here was they were always driven to prove their detractors wrong. But it was two strong people. But if you spoke to those two people, they wouldn't have said it was them. You know, they would have said it was the collective effort, which in many ways it was. Like for that chairman to convince all those farmers to come together and work in unison, that's not an easy thing to do in any country. And then for the chief executive, you know, as soon as the company started to grow, what they started to do was hire guys straight out of college. He was there like, they hired me 3 years out of college, and he started doing the same. They weren't bringing in these big executives or these big managers. They drew all the talent within. And that was really, it's people, it's very much a people story, the success here. But it's attitude. The attitude was right, I think, at the start. And they've just been building on that attitude for 40 years.
What was the duration of each phase in your case?
Here it's about, the example I gave is about every 7 or 8 years they've been yeah, we carry about every 8 to 9 years they've kind of developed a new phase. That's 7 years. This chart I've taken from, I can dig out where I took it from, but I've been using this for a while. But
It's Porter, no? It's Porter's approach.
It's a guy called Cook. The guy who developed this, he's from the University of Madison, I think, in Wisconsin. Cook. But in the US, for example, the average lifespan of a private business is 7 years, the average. I think it depends on your business. It depends on the nature of your business. Yeah.
I mean, in your case, about Kerry.
About 8 or 9 years. They kind of went through a revolution every 8 to 9 years.
Especially growth and maturity.
Well, the growth has been pretty much static. Well, the mature, you know, they got to say 2 billion per year in sales pretty quick, and then it was a little slower to double. They've abandoned that, you know, we will double in size every 5 years. They haven't done that. So they've probably gone from 5 billion a year in sales to 7 in the last, say, 10 years. The growth has been slower, but what they've been doing now has been, they're adding more and more value now.
And where is Kerry currently on this curve?
Well, I think they're here again with their new strategy. You know, well, just on the 8 or 9 years. So the last 3 CEOs, it's about So Dennis Brosnan was there, as I say, he started when he was 27 and he left when he was 50. And then the guy took over from State for 5 years. Then you had a guy called Stan McCarthy, he was there for 9 years, and their new CEO is actually from the region, County Kerry, but they brought him in from their Asian division. So they sent him out to Asia when he was a young kid, and he's been there for 3 years. So now, you know, they're probably here, but now they're reinventing themselves again as this sustainability. They're now tapping into the whole area of climate change and reinventing their whole business around sustainable food products. So what they tend to do is, as they grow, is non-core assets. They start to divest, and then they start to acquire more. They're at that stage now.
You told that there were 2 companies in one region with one type of product, and this has become very successful, and second didn't. Maybe because this company started with the uniting of 3 shareholders of state company, American company, and that 8 farmers and investment of $200,000. Probably this is the key.
Yes, but keep the co-op came first. So the co-op drove. So Kerry was 8. There was 10 co-ops in the region.
And state company. It is stated on the website of this company.
No, the state company was actually, it's a complicated thing. It's called the Dairy Disposals Act.
Mm-hmm.
So they were actually failed co-ops. So there were co-ops that the state had to take over because the co-op went bankrupt.
And the American company was the investor.
So no, the American company was
a shareholder, but as an investor.
As an investor as well, because what they did was they knew, again, it goes back to competency. It's knowing what you can do well. Erie Casing, who was the co-investor, so they were the largest buyers of what's called casein in the US. There's 3 countries in the world today that produce casein. There's no actual casein produced in the US anymore. France, New Zealand, Ireland are the 3 largest producers of casein in the world. These guys didn't have the expertise to produce casein when they started.
They shouldn't. I think that American investor was looking a special place where it is already exists. He come to a market of Ireland, find farmers, and this is the key of huge success.
Well, as I say, they need the expertise and they need the financing for sure.
And they bring the expertise for them.
That's exactly what, because they didn't have it. But if you keep reading, if you read forward another 10 years.
I'm blonde, I can't read more.
If you read forward another 10 years, Kerry bought the company. The company went bankrupt. Kerry bought 10 years after. So Kerry will make, one thing you'll find Kerry, they'll be the first to say it, they always want to be the first to be second. They don't want to reinvent anything. So they will bring in expertise and then they will do it better than anyone else has ever done it. And I'm actually, in many ways, I'm an advocate for joint ventures. You know, if you don't have the expertise and if you don't know what to do with it, find someone that you can team up with and learn from them, and over time then either do it yourself or, as Kerry did, they acquired their initial investor. Their initial investor went bankrupt and they acquired it.
Can you tell us a bit more about succession planning in the company?
I worked on it when I was in Ireland, and we would have had the belief Well, one it was challenging because, particularly the environment I work in, you get elected to the board. You're not appointed; you get elected. But so it's a sensitive subject if you start training people, but those people need to be elected. What we were doing was we were looking at potential young leaders who would be ready to sit in the board maybe 5 or 10 years out. Is the way we were doing it within the dairy industry in Ireland. We were providing training, getting them more up to speed on financial literacy, operations, management, corporate governance, and communication. So it was mainly through training, identifying people early enough and kind of putting them through a program. But kind of, as I say, not looking for people who just wanted to do it. We try to identify potential leaders. Because not everybody wants to lead. Not everybody wants to lead. A lot of people want to manage, but not everybody wants to lead. So it's one, it's identifying the right people, and two, which I know is a bit difficult, can be a bit difficult here in Ukraine with family-owned businesses sometimes, because
Okay, how do you define leadership in your opinion?
What we would have done was we would have gone to, we would have relied on the judgment of others. We would have gone to the people that we would have known are the leaders and say, who's a shining star, who really stands out. So we would have put through, we developed one of the most extensive training programs in about 40 years in Ireland for young future leaders, but we would have relied on others to identify the leaders. And then after that, another thing we did after that, we created a formal course open to everybody around entrepreneurship. So we actually combined entrepreneurship with corporate governance. So we took a slightly different approach to corporate governance training. That we developed a formalized training where people got a certificate in corporate governance, but the title of the course was actually Leadership and Entrepreneurship. It's really kind of it's helping people to focus in on a decision-making process. And not being afraid to make decisions or not to be afraid of change. And the other thing we did as part of that training is we took people outside their comfort zones. So on that leadership and development program, I'll never forget it, we had 15 farmers and we had some case study tours. And one of the case study tours was to Intel. They make the microchips in your computer. So we took 15 farmers to watch microchips be made. And every farmer said it was the best case study tour they'd ever been on. All Intel do is they make the microchip that runs your computer, that drives the memory in your computer. But we went to Intel to learn about innovation. And what the farmers realized that the innovation process, or the thought process within Intel, this multi-billion-dollar company, is the same on the farm, it's the same in a cheese factory, it's the same. So one thing we really did on training was expose people to different industries and different ideas. In one way to inspire them, but what we found out by accident was it actually gave them more confidence. Because they saw that, at the end of the day, people are people. So what they saw was, a decision-making process in all these different companies, in many ways, is no different than my own business. But that's one thing they do around succession planning in Ireland as well, is it's to try and get people to go on international visits. It's nationally too, the government has done a lot in that area. They did a big corporate governance training for what they call high growth, medium-sized companies. And they would have done it as a kind of an executive management program, but it's taken to different countries. For two reasons. One, to expose them to new ideas, but the other thing was to get individuals of, say, similar age and similar sized companies in the same country working on the same program. So it was very social. Part of the reason why they did that international travel was for people to start talking to other people and start learning from other people. You don't always have to sit in a classroom to learn things. So I think one good thing we do in Ireland around the corporate governance training we do is, because we like to drink too, is we do make it social. So when we do training, we try and do 2-day trainings where people, you learn more at the bar at night about business and how to do things. If you're sitting with your peers, we really try and focus in and try and learn from your peers. So what Elaine did publish beforehand. This is from Kerry's own website, as I say, they have a new strategy out. That's a one-page summary of that company. And you can see the growth. Question was asked about their growth rate. You can see it pretty much continuous for the last.
Could you give some information on structure and composition of the growth?
Yeah, you mentioned special structure, so how was it different? Was it flat? What was peculiar about it?
On which, on the. Just if you could repeat the question.
You mentioned that the structure was unique. In which way was it unique?
Structure of the work?
Yes, structure of the
Yes,
work.
I'm interested as well. The structure, size, and
Well, the board has changed recently. The board, when it initially started, I would say the structure wasn't ideal, but the board is probably too big. But what you have to remember at the time when they started was they were trying to bring together a few thousand farmers. So they initially, when the board was formed, in every village you might have people, there might have been 5 telephones in a village. So the communication, the means of communication was that the board member went back. But what they had was they had a 2-tiered governance structure when they started out. They had what was called an outside advisory council and a board. So they did it initially geographically. So, and again, that was just to facilitate the communication networks at the time. They had a board member who represented a district, and underneath that, then they would have had a 2nd tier, what they call advisory council. Advisory council. So you had the chair, you had a board, that's 17 the board at the time, with the outside shareholders as well. Yuri Casey were in there as well, and someone representing the state, which was bought out in a few years. And then, so they elected each board member by district, and then in each district there was an advisory council for the board. It wouldn't be practical here. It wouldn't be practical here. But the key thing they did, I think, structurally was to make sure everybody was on the same page. And then as the company grew, they started to start bringing in more independent directors, or start bringing in directors where they lacked the expertise themselves, particularly on financing. So, you know, when they started growing very much internationally, they would have started bringing in more experts around international financing, investments, things like that. But as I said, the key thing that they had was around communication across all levels of the organization. And I do see that as a challenge here in some large companies here in Ukraine. I think what goes on within a board in some Ukrainian companies, I don't know how well that's communicated down. So like if you're coming up with the direction and the ethos of the company, and if the person working in the factory, you know, if that's never communicated to them, then what happens at the boardroom table is just paper. It's just words.
How many persons were in board in the beginning and later?
I think it was, initially it would have been too big. There'd have been about 20. But again, as I say, it was when you bring together 8 different little co-ops, and then it would have gone down to 17 over time, and then they would have, the council would have been big. There'd been about 150 in the council. But the council was more of a communication channel. It was like the council, the future board members really came from the council, but you had, rather than the chief executive or the chairman meeting 3,000 farmers all the time, they were going to regional council meetings every 4 to 6 weeks, where they were meeting, when I say 150, there'd be about 10 in every little council, and then they'd meet those kind of farmer leaders, and then the information would be dispersed. What's on it today? I don't actually know. I know there's been changes. It's markedly different now. But from my own experience, I think once you start getting more than 10 or 11 people around the table, I don't know. I think there's 11 or 13.
Same people and same number.
11 or 13. But there's very few farmers. I don't know if there's any farmers on the board now.
How is the board related? And is it related for each member or the total for us? We are eager to know everything.
One thing that I don't know if this is, well, here's the thing with this organization. It might be the best example because Kerry floated as a company in 1986. And the initial share price was around 60 euro cents per share. Every share now carries worth 110 euros. So people don't question the board and Kerry too much because the share price has never gone down. The share price, the performance of the company continues, and as the performance continues, yeah.
My ability to read come back to me.
But in terms of earnings per share, it's one of the best performing companies in the food industry. Very unusual in the food industry to see anything like that. But to answer your specific question, I don't have the answer actually. They would bring in outside evaluators. They would work with the Irish Management Institute a lot with their executives. So they would bring in outsiders to evaluate. They still have an annual general meeting every year, and you know the directors are voted on, and it's still possible to remove directors if needs be. I don't know what the law in Ukraine is like. It's probably easier to do in Ireland. It's very easy to bring a motion and vote out directors if needs be. It's a public company, so as long as the shareholders are happy.
And where is it listed?
It's listed near Stock Exchange, and it's also listed on the LSE as well, I think.
Just on, okay.
Most of the shares in the Irish Stock Exchange.
We have it.
But if I want to talk about shareholder value, there was a neighbour of mine, when he died, he had 15 cows. He had no children, no family, and all he had was his 15 cows and 400,000 euros of Kerry shares. So there's millionaire farmers in Ireland because of they always brought the farmers with them. And I cannot stress enough what they did around communication. And I use the word, I think I used the word in the presentation, stakeholders. It's you know, does every member of staff know what this company is about? Does every shareholder know what this company is about? Always keep them informed. It's one way you have to do with farmers. The farmer always fears the worst. He always thinks you're lying to him or you know, even in private companies here in Ukraine, I think there's probably the whole area of communication is just as important, I think, as anything else around the running boards here. Elaine has my details. I'm happy to answer if you want to email me questions or anything like that. Feel free to send them on to Elaine. I don't want to keep you too late.
Don't you mind if you will share this presentation
No,
with
please.
our participants?
Please.
So you will receive. We also got some comments from our audience watching us online,
Okay.
and all of them are grateful for such a wonderful presentation. You see, you made people really interested. They took their phones not to get distracted, but in the case when they start searching for more details, some information. So we are really, really grateful.
No, I'm happy. Delighted to be here.
We hope you will come to us soon.
Pleasure. No, pleasure. Thanks.
And we will be able to meet here again. Thanks again, everybody.